Welcome to Poland Daily History with me, Nicholas Richardson. In this series of episodes, we're going to be looking at Polish history from a British perspective and also Anglo-Polish relations in a geopolitical context. And I'm delighted to have with me in the studio today Richard Berkeley, who is half Polish. He's been living in Poland for 20 years and is able to bring a unique perspective onto this subject. Richard, thank you for joining me.
Pleasure, thanks for having me.
Could we just start, I think, just by saying a few words about your background? You have a Polish father, or you had a Polish father. I think
I had a Polish father. My mother, I think, had too much gin one night in Onslow Square, and was waylaid by this young Polish soldier, and it must have been very all right to be Polish in those days, because my mother otherwise would not have relinquished whatever she had in order to produce me. But they produced me, and of course my father was already married to an English girl anyway.
Ah, right.
And he had a rather domineering Welsh father-in-law, who I think was a minister in a Welsh church, who descended on London with a vengeance when he discovered that his son-in-law was vagrant and from the home. And my father had to go back to his wife. I don't think it was... my mother remained in love with him, actually, all her life, I think. And she had this strange sense of Polish history. I mean, I don't think she knew where Poland was, but she'd known my father well enough in the short time that she'd known him to hear all about his view of the war and what it was like to be Polish and his upbringing, which had been very unusual, actually, because his father was the chief doctor of the railway in Lviv.
Right.
And this was a very prestigious position. But his mother was about 20 years younger than his father. And his father was very, very difficult. I mean, a cousin of mine here, when I met him, told me that my grandfather was actually a psychopath. And there's much in his history to support that. But anyway, they divorced in about 1930. And I think my grandmother had very good reason to divorce him. I mean, one day, for example, she went home and found the house was empty. And she assumed that they'd been burgled. So she rang up my grandfather in the hospital and said, we've been burgled. And he said, well, why do you think that? And she said, well, everything is gone, even the children's clothes. And he said, no, I just thought we had too many things.
Well, he was ahead of his time, clearly.
He was way ahead of his time. He used to, when he was a student, actually, he had it was very interesting, because his father was a great patriot. And they lived in Krakow, having been dispossessed of their estates, because my great-grandfather had actually been part of the 1863 revolt. And I have a photograph of him sitting, rather as we're sitting now, but sitting in between us. And one was the governor of Siberia, and the other was a Russian general. And one of them was holding a bottle, and he's rather sheepish, a sheepish 18-year-old sitting in between them, holding his glass to be poured, a vodka. And he was rather remarkable, because he played the piano very, very well. And actually, after he left Siberia, he went to Berlin to study with Letoshitsky, who was this remarkable Jewish composer and pianist from Weinstut, who actually hugely influenced European piano playing. And
do you think that's maybe where you got your own musical?
Well, it's very interesting, because in my mother's family, we're jumping around rather, but in my mother's family, they were all engineers. I mean, my mother's great-grandfather worked on the rocket with Stephenson. And built Newstead Station, Birmingham, which is interesting because my mother's great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather both built railway stations. My Polish great-great-grandfather here, one of them, built the whole line that goes from Warsaw to Russia, and the other built, Birmingham. And so my mother's family were very much military people, engineers, and landowners, but mostly in the colonies. Whereas here, the rather interestingly, I mean, I actually came to my family here through music, because my father, after we met when I was 42, told me a lot about where he grew up, and he grew up in a house near Rzeszów. When he was with his father's family, when he was with his mother's family, he was in Gdynia. But he told me all about this big house, you see, where he'd grown up, and showed me photographs. So this was a really remarkable thing about Poles. So many of them, you've probably come across this yourself, when they left Poland and went to England during the war or after the war, they all had their photo albums.
Yes.
It's quite remarkable. And my father had a photo album, this thick. So he was able to show me the house and, family, but he didn't want me to meet them.
Oh.
Because actually there was a reason for that, but I'll go into later. But I came here on a visit, having been invited by some Poles, and we went down to this house, and the house is a sort of domdziecko, an orphanage. And the director of the orphanage said, well, you should look up your cousin, because he's the head of all the music schools here.
Ah, right.
And in fact, from about the age of 9, at prep school, I tried my damnedest not to have to play football. And the thing that got me off football more than anything else was singing.
Right.
Because I had a really good treble voice. And so if I was, if I could make the excuse that I was practicing singing, I could get out of a football game, because we had to play football 6 days a week. You probably had the same problem.
Yeah.
And my prep school was right on the top of a cliff overlooking Seaford. And when the winds were blowing in winter, the inside of your legs got horribly chapped by the salt air. And
yeah, I can imagine.
Oh,
Yeah.
no, just beastly, absolutely beastly. So it put me off football for life, actually, having to play it every day.